Thank you, everybody. It's great to see such a big turnout. This is the very first event in the calendar for HCRI, so we're all very excited for the year ahead. I just want to give a tiny little introduction to HCRI, because there are a lot of people I know have come this evening who aren't from HCRI. So HCRI, to condense it, is an interdisciplinary institute in the School of Arts, Languages and Cultures, and we draw on peace and conflict studies, international relations, development studies, geography, medicine, history. We look through those different disciplines to understand humanitarianism, disasters, conflict situations, and we have a large network of partners that we work with. They include Save the Children, International Alert, MSF, the World Health Organization, and it's really a manner of our research is informing practice on the ground, and then those practitioners, they come in and they teach our students. So for all the new students here this year, they will have a lot of faces coming in and out from different organisations. So this really is sort of the event to kick off the year and to welcome all the new students. It's a really exciting year. We've got 3 master's programmes, we've got our intercalating medics, and it's a particularly special year, I would say, because we've got a brand new undergraduate degree which was launched this year in international disaster management and humanitarian response. So we've been working on that for the past 15 months. It maybe feels like 15 years, but 15 months. And then it's all culminated with 25 new recruits have joined this September, and we'll be working together for the next 3 years. That's really, really exciting. So a very warm welcome from everybody at HCRI. And the event this evening has been purposefully chosen because we wanted to present or have a speaker come and talk to you about issues that, or the ways that the crises or the situations that you'll be learning about over the next year, the 3 years, how they're presented in the media. Everybody's familiar with the refugee crisis or different disasters in the media, but it's really important to start thinking about those critically. I know that there are students here who have been inspired by the Mediterranean refugee crisis and have joined the Institute to learn more about that. There are students here who've been working to address the crisis, and surely there will be people here who will be going to work there. So it's really interesting to have Lilie Chouliaraki talk about how that is, what those images and what those stories and those headlines actually mean, to start thinking about them critically. Okay, so we're very, very lucky to have Professor Lilie Chouliaraki with us this evening. She's Professor of Media and Communication Studies at the London School of Economics, and I'm very familiar with her work. She's published very widely on the ideas of media ethics and the moral implications of when we portray suffering others, people in poverty and war and famines, to the public. You know, what is the ethics and the power dynamics around that? Can it produce social change and activism? These are kinds of issues that Lilie is looking at in disaster news and humanitarian campaigns. And she's traced, part of her work is to trace humanitarian campaigns over the past decades, and to look at how they've changed over the years. It's not a fire, is it?
Yeah, sorry, by accident.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, pardon?
Is that the moment where everyone has to scream and run?
No, not yet. I'll let you know. Yeah, so that's the work that Lilie's working on, is looking at rock concerts, celebrity, humanitarian campaigns, war journalism, and looking at how those images shape the way the public perceives and responds to humanitarian crises. She's published widely, and one of her most famous pieces is The Ironic Spectator, which is a fantastic book. I recommend that. So I'd like you to join me in welcoming Lilie to HCRI for this event. Thank you.
Gemma, for the kind words. Can you hear me everywhere? Not really. We can hear your phone, though. How about now? Better? Yeah. Okay. So I am the lucky one to be able to be here because this is such a vibrant, and incredibly dynamic place to study and to teach, for those of you who teach here, issues that have to do with humanitarianism, humanitarian communication, human rights, that it is great for me to just come here and share my ideas with you. At LSE, we are at the moment running a project, we're wrapping it up actually, on the mediation of the migration crisis. And what I'm going to be presenting today is part of that work. Research work that was also conducted by some of our students who volunteered and helped us map out and classify our data. Part of that is about visual communication and how the UK press and online media have been representing the crisis in the past 15 months or so. So from the beginning of the crisis around May 2015 until around about, not now, but March 2016. And so what I would like to do today is just present you with some of our ideas around that and tie it in with a bit of theory and tie it in also with some conclusions and some diagnosis as to what that mediation does to the refugees, but also to us as the kind of public actors who are on the receiving end of those mediations. So let me start with the juxtaposition of those two pictures. And we can see the similarities between them. How do I go back? Like this, yes. So even in the angle by which they were taken, they are very similar. And it's a particular perspective, if you like, to kind of capture the depth of the kind of long line of people walking to a particular direction. One of the most important, significant political theorists of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, termed those people back then superfluous people. And that was her name for the mobile populations of the Second World War who were stripped of their rights to citizenship under conditions of persecution, and they were moving from border to border, unable to find refuge in Europe. So she talks about superfluous people as people who both have no state, and so they have no citizenship and no citizenship rights. But interestingly for us, in her theory, she also talks about those people as people who have no visibility. They cannot appear to act and speak in public. We don't see them in our media, in the media of the time and our media today. Not only do they have no agency because they are not citizens and they have no rights, but also they do not have any simple presence or agentive presence. They are not seen to act in any situation, under no circumstance, any circumstances. And Hannah Arendt continues that it is these two conditions together, statelessness and invisibility, that removes those people from the sphere of the political, from the public sphere, and reduces them to their biological life. They are just people who have basic needs. They are not citizens who are there to think, talk, and act in society. So even though they are presented as human, they are human, they may not be humanized. And we are going to be talking about that distinction later. Now, this is relevant to us Because today I will talk precisely about refugees and migrants and immigrants in the Mediterranean as people who are superfluous precisely for the same reasons as the refugees of the Second World War. Because like them, they have no state and no visibility. We see them too as only human, but not necessarily as humanized. And we will be looking at how the patterns of visual representation that the UK media have put forward for us. But why should we be looking at visual media? The reason why visibility, the possibility of seeing others and others appearing to us matters is because the very appearance of people in need, of vulnerable people in the media, raises by itself important questions for us as citizens, as actors of the public sphere, as public actors. And these questions are both ethical and political. And these questions are also raised independently of whether we want these questions raised in our lives. We are being addressed by them despite our will, as Judith Butler has made that point. So what is the key question that these images raise? The question they raise is the question of what to do. What can we do in the face of that suffering? In other words, this is the question of responsibility. We may decide, of course, to do nothing. Most of us do nothing or very little. But this is also a decision in a way. And as such, it is also a response to the question of what to do, the question of responsibility. So the media, I've said, are important precisely because they open up that space where the others appear to us. They become visible, and they raise that question, the ethical question of what to do, the question of responsibility. But how do they do it? They do it because they routinely communicate imaginary options for action for us, on our behalf. By presenting those others, they also propose ideal forms of citizenship that we are invited to perform in relation to them. And I have talked about the performative role of journalism, not as something that simply informs us, but also as something that shapes us actively as citizens and requires of us to imagine what kinds of actors we are at the same time as it informs us. Another way to put this is to say that the focus on the images of migrants and refugees in the UK press helps us look into the question of responsibility as a problem of communication. Responsibility is also a problem of communication. Not, that is to say, as a problem that each one of us individually faces, but as a problem of the symbolic performances of the media and the ways in which, as I said, that they become invitations to us to be certain types of citizens, to care or not to care, or if to care, then in what ways to care, as we're going to see in the course of the talk. So it is important that we do this mapping out that I am going to kind of get into in a few minutes. Do this mapping out of the patterns of migration imagery, because by doing so, we can also see how these media want us to behave. Not in any kind of explicit imperative way, be like this, but how they also include imaginations of who we should be, and by doing that, we get into particular political imaginaries of responsibility. So talking about responsibility and the media is a theoretical point that I try to kind of develop very quickly right now, but it is also an empirical question. Why do the media matter in questions of responsibility? Well, because without seeing what's going on somewhere in the borders, how could we, here in the UK, or people in Sweden, know what's going on in the first place? So there are kind of practical as well as ethical and political reasons why responsibility and the media and the images of the media matter, and we should study them together. So this is what we are already doing. The kind of bullet point number 1 up there. We are talking about responsibility, visibility, and we are talking about pity as well. And I'm going to explain what pity is in a minute. And this is the kind of vocabulary that we need in order then to be able to read the representations that we are going to see. And once I finish with that bit that we are in now, I'm going to go into the typology, the kind of different types of images that we are confronted with. And then at the end, I'm going to kind of conclude with implications and alternatives. If we can think of any alternatives in the representation of refugees and migrants, that might make things a bit better. So, talking about responsibility, coming back to that point, I just asked, how do the media invite us to react towards images like the ones we saw that take place everywhere, or have been taking place everywhere in Europe? And I'm sure you've seen other images as well in the shores of Lampedusa in southern Italy or the Greek islands as well. So how do you react to those pictures there? Let me specify this question a bit more now to get into the concept of pity. Which options do the media give us? Why should we be watching these things if there is nothing to do, nothing to feel? So what do they do? Do they want us to turn away, just sit and forget about it? Do they want us to kind of shed a tear and be emotional about it and maybe donate some clothes to a charity, the Care for Calais or Citizens for Refugees in Lesbos, etc.? Or do they want us to get indignant and protest against hate speech and against the politics of exclusion in so many European countries that we have seen that happening, as for instance in the refugee welcome protests that took place last year? Now, all these options that we think are personal reactions of ours when we see something in the media, here is the key point I was trying to explain earlier as well, is that they are already encoded in, they are already enacted symbolically through what another very important theorist, Luc Boltanski, calls the media's politics of pity. And when he talks about the politics of pity, what he refers to is all these different patterns of representation that the media use in order to elicit emotion from us, to kind of introduce us into and invite us into particular, if you like, affective dynamics with the sufferers that we are confronting in the images. And with those affective regimes, those affective dynamics, also come questions of responsibility. For instance, when we see images of migrants with a pope or with medical staff, like MSF staff, try and kind of either comfort or care for people, what the media perform is a particular politics of pity, what we might call a politics of empathy, which invites imaginaries of charitable publics. So responsibility in that representation is about care and hospitality to vulnerable others. But there are other ways in which the politics of pity configure us and the others in ways that elicit and cultivate and encourage different relationships, different emotional connections. So, in the discussion we've had so far, responsibility means something that I'm going to redefine now. Responsibility here means feeling something, pity, in different ways, about those depicted to suffer, and doing something, caring, sending clothes, or putting a donation in, or whatever, doing something, exercising some form of agency, being actors to alleviate their suffering as much as we can. That's the kind of idea of responsibility the media operate in, okay? And we've explained that relationship so far. The donation, the demonstration, or even the tweet are, in this sense, two of the kind of emotional and practical responses to the media's call for responsibility. But should we really just leave it to that? Is that enough? When we try to understand the encounter with a category of people like refugees, whose arrival, we must never forget, has been unexpected for the majority and uninvited. Nobody invited them to come. They came. They just arrived in the shores of Greece and Italy. Don't we need to go beyond that idea that, okay, I sent a package somewhere and I just did my bit, or just try to understand them in terms of a kind of practical and minimally emotional way? In order for us to understand who these people are, what kinds of demands they make on our societies, and how the media should be approaching them, if we want to go out of the situation where we are now, where people are just pushed away from Europe, or are basically imprisoned in camps in Greece, and some of them deported as well, then responsibility should be something more than just the practical action that the media might or might not engage us in. It must be something more. So the last part of the theoretical aspect of the talk that I'm giving now is kind of pushing the concept of responsibility to understand it as something more complex than what we have seen it so far. All those practical forms of responsibility are, we might call, formal responsibilities. Formal responsibilities, and I'm here using the term by Roger Silverstone, one major theorist in the field of media and communications. And those practical, formal forms of responsibility already presuppose a more profound sense of responsibility that both informs and shapes our practical responses to suffering. They point to what Silverstone calls, and that's the second bit, an existential or substantial form of responsibility, one that does not only recognize that these people are suffering, and I can send a tweet or a package, but it also recognizes that those people are connected to us as actors on their suffering through a relationship of inevitable interchangeability. They and us could be the other way around. They are human in that way, that we are sharing that vulnerability that they have. Of course, you may ask the obvious question, how interchangeable can we be when they inhabit conflict zones, which are inherently risky, and we inhabit the much safer zones of Manchester or London, or anywhere really in Western Europe? Well, there are two reasons, at least, to think that. The first is the historical argument, that some of those people in the first slide have been our grandfathers and great-grandfathers. So Europe generated about 60 million refugees in the course of the Second World War, a few generations ago. So there's always a historical argument. We should never lose sight of history. And the second is that we must not forget that what the battlefield is today, where people are killed by different kinds of militants, has been deterritorialized, which means it is not confined in the traditional conflict zones as in the past, as in the First World War, for example. Was the no man's land? No, it's not. If we think of Paris and Brussels and all sorts of different signals that we get in the big cities where we live, basically what they're suggesting is that the battlefield is now without territory. It's deterritorialized. So the distinction between them and us is much more precarious than we actually think. And to understand that, we need to grasp that idea of existential responsibility, that idea of inevitable interdependence. That even though we are not the same, our fates, in some way, have been and might be similar. That idea that those who are public actors and citizens in Western metropolis are very different, ontologically different from those who are sufferers coming to our shores asking for asylum, for instance, or just for a job, as pure and exclusive victims, is something that, again, the political theorist of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, has challenged. And what she says is basically that the sufferer and the actor are just two roles that everybody plays in their lives. She says, because the actor always moves among and in relation to other acting beings, he's never merely a doer, but always and at the same time a sufferer. To do and to suffer are like opposite sides of the same coin, and the story that an act starts is composed of its consequent deeds and sufferings. So Hannah Arendt defines responsibility here not in affective or practical terms, I become responsible because these images make me feel indignant, but first of all, and together with that, because in existential terms, those people and I do not belong in radically different human orders. We are connected in some way. And again, here the media matter, because how exactly they portray that dynamic between us and them, who is drawn within that sphere of commonness? Is it, do they appear as participating in activities or worlds that are like ours? How do the media make us relate, show us, portray us as relating with them? Who acts on whom in the representations of the media? Who speaks? All these things matter in terms of cultivating that more fundamental idea of existential responsibility, of connecting with the others as human beings at a level that is not only about me acting on you. So in that sense, responsibility cannot be taken for granted. It has to be constantly communicated in the spaces of appearance where these people appear and we appear and watch them too. So with these ideas in mind, let us now turn to the images that we have kind of configured together in terms of different patterns of representation that point to similar features in terms of who is represented, how, in which particular ways, and what forms of responsibilities they evoke through those representations in order to get an idea of how our media have done that job. So what I'm going to be talking you through from now on is those 5 different types of representation where responsibility figures in different ways. So we look at the ways in which migrants and refugees are portrayed, how we appear in those representations, what kinds of actors we are expected to be, and what forms of responsibility are being articulated through that. So we're going to be looking at vulnerability as biological life. I've already talked a little bit about that. So you already have an idea of what these representations are like. But then we are going to be moving into vulnerability as pity, which actually here should have been empathy, as you will see later. So it is about caring and about showing emotion. in a responsibility that is precisely that, affective. I could have also put it down as sentimental, and which construes or imagines us as a charitable public. We give something, a donation or whatever. Then I'm moving to vulnerability as hospitality, with the refugees welcome. A type of activism, which is a more politicized form of responsibility of the activist public. Then we are moving into vulnerability as institutional benevolence, where we really see how celebrities, not only celebrities in the sense of Angelina Jolie, but also the Pope or Merkel or a lot of other kind of authority figures have been appearing next to refugees in camps and elsewhere, and what kinds of claims they make in terms of the responsibility we should be assuming. And then we're going to go into vulnerability as self-reflexivity. We kind of left, this is really kind of a representational category where the mainstream media draw on Twitter and the social media, and how they kind of reproduce what the social media have said. And so that is what we might call that vulnerability as self-reflexivity. So we're going to go through these categories and then ask the question about what kinds of responsibility these put forward, and whether, if these are all forms of formal responsibility, practical responsibility, where is the existential responsibility in all this? Where is the interchangeability, the assumption that we are all human in different ways, but ultimately interchangeable ways? A kind of a more fundamental sense in which we might be enacting our solidarity with those people. And I'm going to end up with a couple of recommendations, as I said, as to how to move forward from here. So let's start for now with the vulnerability as biological life. So these are the images in this. And they come from that's the Zaatari Syrian refugee camp, which is really, last year it was Syria's 5th biggest city in terms of the kind of population size. And here we see some more close-up shots of a UN camp. So what are the things to focus on here? First of all, what characterizes both types of images is it's the focus on sizes here, right? And generality in all of them. We don't see particular individuals, we see types of people. And we see masses of tents or figures that move in space. There is already a large amount of research done on the particular characteristics of humanitarian crises that are presented in that way. And that critique is talking about the massification of people, that it foregrounds groups, it doesn't foreground individuals. The generalization of the category of the refugee, where they're given no name and they are simply a visual category that doesn't allow for specificity. And decontextualization, that most of them give little or no specification in terms of the geography, the kind of areas, the living conditions, and the history of where these people come from and why. And I'm going to come back to that in order to say that a lot of humanitarian reporting, particularly in the refugee crisis, is not connected to war reporting. The fact that these people are actually fleeing war. So war reporting and humanitarian crisis reporting are kept as two separate kind of journalistic practices, if you like, that rarely come together. So just like Hannah Arendt referred earlier to superfluous people, people who only have a biological life, similarly here, people remain unspecified, unnamed, and generalizable. There are masses of what she would call biological life to be managed in terms of their physical needs. So we see here the, water, sleep, food, etc., etc. So what form of responsibility is this? It is a responsibility based on a minimal encounter. There is no potential for interchangeability or recognition. There is no interest in who these are. It is about knowing that they are there. It is about monitoring the situation. And we can call it latent responsibility because it relies precisely on this light touch catch-up with world events of little or no relevance to us, really. It kind of connects with what a media theorist, Michael Schatzen, calls monitorial citizenship. We just need to check what's going on, but we don't really need to get involved. There's nothing for us to do or say about this. I have talked you through these. Before we move on now to vulnerability as empathy. I wonder whether I should ask questions rather than speak that out. Can I? Do we have the time? So how does that differ from what we saw before? That's what I do to my class. So I can see most of you are very young, and I'm sure you're here to study these things. And I just wanted to ask you, how does that differ from the previous one? Yes?
This is less generalization and more focusing on an individual.
And more focusing on individuals. This is also important, right? What else? Yeah?
It shows emotion.
It shows emotion. What kind of emotion?
Grief, pain, horror.
Yes. We see people who are in distress, and we see a particular category of people. What's that?
It focuses on children.
It focuses on children. Yes, all of them actually focus on children. Yeah?
I think this is about how a single individual becomes a symbol for a mass of people.
Here.
Yeah.
Yes, and we're going to come back to that point a bit later. But for now, let's start with the first point, which was very good. We here have actually focused both on groups and individuals. We have a kind of individuation of the representation, particularly in this. But even here, because there's a focal point in the photograph. So individuation has potential for more humanized representations. And children, the focus on children that we mentioned, are important, and they are very much used in humanitarian communication precisely because they stand as paradigmatic instances of innocence, and for that reason of absolute vulnerability. So they are quintessential instruments, if you like, in the politics of pity that plays particularly on the emotion of empathy. It really is an emotion of parental care that is being activated in that visual relationship between us and them. We can say that the image of Aylan Kurdi has acquired such iconic status in global media, at least partly, precisely as an icon of parental failure. It visualized the failure to offer protection to a child and points to the West as a failed parent, as a failed pastoral figure, or as a particular kind of benevolent public that just didn't do its job. So we can see how particular signifiers of pity, and particularly empathy, can be mobilized in particular relationships of empathy and guilt at the same time in media representations. However, and despite the fact that these representations differ from the previous ones, there are two things that again have been singled out in literature on humanitarian communication as undermining the potential for humanization and the potential for a kind of more substantial form of responsibility to kind of be articulated through them. The first one is infantilization. That this evocation of parental care as the kind of starting point, as a catalyst for empathy, is at the same time also an infantilization of the category of the refugee, predominantly now represented through the figure of the child as distressed, exhausted, or dead, as somebody who doesn't have much agency, cannot do many things, is waiting to be saved. And the second thing that I think is evident both here and here is this idea of representation as signifying borders. So we can call these particular images here, and this is a pattern that is actually represented quite often, is repeated quite often, as symbolic bordering, a visual strategy that marks those depicted as those others, the refugees, as radically distinct from those who watch them. And we can see here how this happens. First of all, the barbed wire, and second, the shields, right? They are kinds of borders. And here we can see the kind of the shore. Yeah, the shore, that's right. That division between water and land that has been absolutely iconic in terms of the effort of those people to come here. So we see those lines that kind of traverse those representations of empathy that at the same time that they try to evoke positive emotions of parental care, they also remind us that there is actually a deep divide between us, should this border be crossed or not. So it is a visual strategy that reproduces physical distance and thematizes transgression. So to sum up, unlike biological life, which we saw earlier, this category does raise the question of a response. What response shall we give? The presence of the other is much more diverse and singularized, but it still is deprived of agency and depth. And affective responsibility, the responsibility of emotion, of sentimental emotion, is a moralizing response to refugee suffering that displaces or ignores or sidelines political questions into emotions of guilt, tender-heartedness, and indignation. Again, we have no context. We do not ask the difficult questions. Why are these people trying to reach this? And what can be done in relation to the bigger picture, which actually pushed them to leave their homes and put a 3-year-old in a precarious dinghy to cross the Aegean Sea. So what do we have here then? What's the key word in these ones?
Welcome.
Welcome, yes, welcome. And so the act of welcome, let me put it that way, the act of welcome is an act of hospitality. So hospitality is really the key word here in this form of this representational pattern. Let me draw again on Roger Silverstone to say that hospitality is about welcoming the other in one's space with or without any expectation of reciprocity. It's about openness and inclusion. So the mediation of vulnerability as hospitality is about visualizing that act of welcome. That's why welcome is such a key word, because it signifies precisely that willingness of that public to open up and receive. The key question, however, when we talk about forms of responsibility and we want to go beyond practical responsibility, is to ask, who acts? And where are the sufferers here? How are they represented? Any ideas? How are they represented? No, they're not. They're nowhere. It really is about us acting in our own space, isn't it? So we have a kind of linguistic representation of them. In refugees welcome, so we have a kind of linguistification of the refugee. It's there in letters, but not as living beings. Not in the visual representations that we've seen, right? Not perhaps, I think in the kind of BBC live broadcasting of the refugee welcome event, there were people who spoke on behalf of refugees, but in online news, in newspapers, in the spaces which you can use as archives and look back, they don't figure at all. So they didn't use them there. So let me go back to the point. Hospitality is basically represented exclusively as a space of Western agency through the idea of, through the visualization of a mass demonstration. And of course, this is good because demonstrations are one of the few forms of effective action available in the repertoire of civil society. So we are asserting our will to open the borders and have people in. But as I said, the problem is that there is nobody else there. So why we are doing it has to do with us, if you like, giving an account of ourselves, being political, being activist, asserting our political will, but not much about context. What are the complexities involved in hospitality? Is it easy to be hospitable? What are the challenges? Why are there disagreements? Why is there controversy? What about the broader debates? So let me just sum up those three types of responsibility that we have seen being enacted through the representational patterns of the media. From biological life to empathy to hospitality, what is sidelined is, what is it? What have I been coming back again and again at the risk of being very boring? What is missing?
Context.
Sorry?
Context.
Context?
And political responsibility.
The difficult questions, as we've put them. Yes, exactly. It's the hard questions, the questions that are difficult to navigate through and respond to. And also, the figure of the other is missing as a substantial presence. Not as a shadow, as in the first one, as a crying child, or a crying mother, or an exasperated dad, but as a human being with a history and a voice. And I'll come back in the conclusion to that. So let's move on to vulnerability as institutional benevolence. And here, referring to institutional, I mean very broadly, on the one hand, global governance organizations like the UN, but also religious leaders who take selfies. I could have put Merkel on as well. So what is the key thing here for you? What is happening here when we see refugees together with celebrities? What's going on there? Anything, really. It's very obvious, I think.
It's a social proof, so it's people that want a respected figure politically or socially or culturally doing something, and so you imitate it by the social act they've taken.
Yeah, I think that is the kind of symbolic economy of celebrity, is to kind of transfer some of its value onto refugees. Recognizability, the fact that they are now legitimate public presences because they've been endorsed, a bit like, you know, branding. You endorse something, a product, and then it becomes more legitimate, more recognizable, more accepted. So so that's the key thing. That's the logic through which things work. But what is the kind of side effect of that? When you, okay, maybe it doesn't work with the Pope that well, but what about this?
It makes the problem valid. You know, it gives it the validity, like through the endorsement, you know, people don't just listen to anybody. They're going to listen to people who are prominent.
Yeah, that's exactly, I mean, that's another formulation that opens up the logic that we've just explained, is the symbolic economy of celebrity as a humanitarian figure, is precisely that. It kind of, it kind of attracts attention and offers validity. Yeah. Yeah?
It makes me wonder about the authenticity. That's on the, I guess, the devil advocates or the skeptic side of things. It makes me wonder about if it's a publicity stunt to see a celebrity or some big-time name with a refugee, and it also makes me think of the optics of a refugee, because if you put a certain person with a celebrity, then for a lot of average Joe people, they're going to assume that everybody who looks like that is going to be a refugee, when in fact it could be me, it could be somebody else, it could be, I mean, there's no race or gender or, you know, ethnicity or color that makes somebody look like a refugee. But when you put a huge picture out there, put out that photo op, a lot of people don't dig deeper to see that. So I question the authenticity of things like that.
So it's authenticity, and it is a big issue, and I've touched exactly on that in work that I have done on celebrities and humanitarian crisis. It's the authenticity of the sufferer as well as the authenticity of the celebrity. Yeah.
It sort of takes away voice from the people who are affected, because it's basically the celebrity speaking for them rather than themselves being given a voice and speaking experiences. So a person from a privileged position is given more attention and more validity than the actual person affected by the issue.
Yeah. Yes. No.
Sort of plotting the crisis in a way for your own, like previously photo op.
So that's part of the symbolic economy of celebrity. The celebrification of a humanitarian cause can be that the focus falls more on the celebrity as a figure that, in a way, has a legitimacy to endorse and render recognizable the cause she or he is speaking for. And by having the focus on the celebrity, missing out on the actual issues that are being debated and why the celebrity might be there. So we might call this a celebrification of humanitarian causes, whereby there are two competing logics. On the one hand, the logic of humanitarian communication, let's get that out there, and the kind of showbiz logic of celebrity communication, which articulate together, and the question is which one wins. And when we are in a kind of popular media framework, it is more often than not, it is a celebrity message that comes through. I will tell you about this particular image here, which is from Piraeus in Greece, when refugees were, about 4,000 refugees were camped outside the port, well, just by the port, really, and Angelina Jolie visited. The news around, well, the television news and newspaper reports were all about her. And the irony is that it was more about her having lost weight rather than the problem of the refugees. So there was concern, but it was a completely misplaced concern. Now, that tells us, of course, more about the state of the media that particular in that particular national context. But I would say that, in fact, that is a kind of that is a dominant economy of news circulation. Those pieces of news that sell, those pieces of news that are recognizable because of their celebrification, will take priority over others. It's a matter of not only the symbolic, but also the political economy of the news. And so we've got to think about celebrification, the celebrification of humanitarianism, not only in terms of its benefits, but also in terms of its costs. Now, what form of responsibility does celebrified humanitarian reporting here put forward or articulate? I call this representative responsibility. And it is a responsibility that does two things. First of all, these figures, by doing the good thing, replace me. So I am a public actor that could be acting out there, but they are doing it, and they have so much symbolic and economic capital that they can just do a much better job. So my agency as a public actor is in a way given out, displaced onto theirs. And second, as we've just established, their aura, their celebrity aura, displaces the cause. The focus is on them and not the reason why they are there. So the key question that we raise when we are talking about the celebrification of the migration issue is how far visual structures of popular and consumer culture enable celebrity humanitarian reporting to go beyond the focus on the celebrity. And the reason why we might call the publics that are actually following and engaging with representative responsibility post-humanitarian, and this is a term that I have developed in my work on the ironic spectator, is that people who see this, like all of you, I'm sure, and beyond us here in this theater, people are quite ambivalent about this. On the one hand, they can see all the good things we've said in this room. It's good that these people speak out. They shed the spotlight on these issues, and it's important that they are being seen, whilst otherwise they might not have. But at the same time, there is disenchantment. I mean, this is all about the celebrity. It's not really about the cause. So there are two competing logics, as I said, which actually renders fair. Something that kind of is suspended between fascination and disillusionment, inspiration and cynicism. And that is where I'm going to leave this. It's not a purely bad or purely good thing, but it does open up a space where there is a fundamental undecidability about the ethical role and the ethical effect of this form of communication. And let me go to the final one, vulnerability as irony. And this is where a lot of media have been, mainstream media have been reporting on social media activity. It is about a particular way in which the death of Aylan Kurdi has been remediated in mainstream media. What can we say about that? You can see here the BBC kind of reproductions of this. So what can we say about that? What's particular about this?
For me, I mean, the image itself was a global, there was a huge response, it was everywhere, it was on social media, but when you put it into an image like this, that you've taken the image of a dying child and now you've said, oh, he's in a better place, in a way, for me, it reduces, it's reductionism, right? Like, it has reduced the problem of hundreds and thousands of children dying every day to, well, they're in heaven, so it's okay that they died. It's a very horrible way of putting it, but I just mean, this is the images that I see, that's the lens that I have, that you've reduced the problem once again. that in the mass of, you know, the
Yeah.
Angelina Jolie going somewhere, Kim Kardashian here, whoever here, whatever, you've reduced the problem once again.
Okay, yeah, yes, yeah, we're going to come back to that, and I think that's a fair criticism of this. But just to say, what's the main characteristic of this is that we are not any longer seeing the picture itself, are we? I mean, we're not confronted by the picture. What are these? These are playful renderings of that picture. They are kind of imaginative and playful replications of it. They can be cartoons or whatever. And they are also framed by precisely what you've just said, a confessional discourse, if you like. It's about my emotions, how I feel. So that death generated a kind of a ritual of collective mourning that found its manifestation, its most spontaneous manifestation in the social media. And the most characteristic visualizations of that manifestation of collective mourning is those forms of images that do not quite reproduce the image, but play around with it as if to take the kind of grittiness of it and the shock from it. So two things that are quite specific here about this form of visualization is that, first of all, they lack an explicit ideological message. So there is no context again, and there is no understanding of why this happened, as there was, for instance, in hospitality. And they also tend to be personalized and, as we've just said, kind of offer confessional responses, how I feel. So what form of responsibility is this? First of all, it's a responsibility that's self-reflexive. It's about us thinking about ourselves and what went wrong. And collective mourning, even if it is not about someone who was personally known and beloved to us, we mourn for people we don't know. It's precisely that kind of self-reflexive process. It kind of brings us back to ourselves and asks the big question. And I said earlier how that was actually framed in a kind of emotion of guilt for the failed pastoral care that the West wasn't able to, yes, the failed pastoral care that was demonstrated in that case. We were not able to act as a responsible parent to that child. And he died. However, that self-reflexivity, again, lacks that context and lacks that particular depth that could take us beyond guilt and beyond conventional manifestations of sadness, horror, or despair. And the reason why we might call them ironic is because, just like the celebrity one, these playful textualities with confessional messages play out a particular way of being solidary, of being public, of engaging with distant suffering today, which is ambivalent, in the sense that on the one hand it wants to participate in the mourning, it wants to participate in the thinking about why this happened, but at the same time it does so from the home, from the space of my personal beliefs and my personal emotions. It doesn't really go out there and claim public action and political response as a legitimate and important and efficient way to deal with these issues. It doesn't go, again, to the hard questions. It is just an enactment of a ritual of mourning, as we said earlier. So that's it, really. We've talked about 5 different ways in which the vulnerability of distant others has been represented in our media. So how can we conclude? I started all this with a very high hope to see whether we might find some elements of existential responsibility in those representations. A responsibility that acknowledges, that recognizes the fundamental interchangeability between us and them. And you may object to that, I'm sure a lot of you object to that, thinking that this is actually a utopia. And in the face of the failure, the political and moral failure of Europe and the world in dealing with the refugee crisis in the past 1.5 years, we might also argue that simply because it is a utopia, and precisely because it is a utopia, it is worth keeping in the discussion. We have now no other better solutions to offer than trying to rethink our relationship with those people and the ways in which we speak about them collectively in our mediated public sphere. And we have no alternatives anyway, or at the moment I can't see any. On the contrary, I would say that even though that crisis continues to be just as urgent and just as important as it used to be, in terms of the people who are trapped, and in terms of the conditions under which they live, and in terms of the continuing crisis in the Middle East, what we see these days is a deafening silence around the problem, a blinding invisibility of that particular issue. Yet, here is what a doctor from Médecins Sans Frontières reported from Greece just last May. He was talking about a traumatized refugee that could go anywhere, and he had seen a lot on his trip there. So this doctor says, I don't know what will happen to him, that particular man he was treating, or indeed anyone stuck in Idomeni, which has now been abolished, and those people have been moved to other camps in Greece. It seems they are trapped in no man's land. As one patient told me, we are dying here just like we were in Syria, but slower. And yet, there's nothing. So let me come back to that idea of existential responsibility as a more fundamental recognition that despite our differences, us and them, we are ontologically interchangeably connected. And I kind of contrasted that with practical responsibility in terms of making a commitment to do something, like charity or activism. On the basis of that distinction, what we also did is we explored how responsibility as a moral vocabulary to address our uninvited and unexpected encounters with vulnerable others was mediated in our media. What did we see? First of all, we have a large number of options in terms of practical responsibility. We have representational patterns of bare life or biological life, hospitality, pity, post-humanitarian irony. And in engaging with those particular representational patterns through our media, we also see ourselves in particular ways. We are the monitorial citizens, we are activists, we are charitable givers, people who shed a tear, who really care, or we are self-reflexive ironists. We don't really believe in the celebrity thing, but look at her, right? So the question is, again, and I'm finishing with a reflection on that, are these practical senses of responsibility enough? I don't believe they are. And there are two things that our media fail to do, which could, however, bring back some sense of existential responsibility into the ways we connect with those others collectively through the symbolic practices of our media. Can anyone think of any of them? They're so simple, and we've talked about them so many times today, and you've raised them as well. So I'm sure you know what I want to conclude with. So maybe we can do it together. No? Okay. So the first is the lack of the historicization of the crisis. There is no clear context within which to place the refugee crisis and within which to explain or justify the exodus of Syrians and other Middle Eastern populations towards Europe. I made a point earlier about the total disconnection between humanitarian crisis and war reporting. So this is Idomeni in March 2016. This is what we've talked about so far. Consequently, also, there has been no debate on how refugees might be seen as opportunities rather than costs in host countries. The discussion so far has been about yes or no quotas throughout the first 6 months of 2016, actually much earlier. In March 2016, the issue was closed. And certain countries refuse to continue the discussion, whilst others are only negotiating very small numbers of admission. There is also very little understanding of the implications of the March 2016 agreement. What did it mean for Europe to decide that these people are going to stay in Greece, some of them being deported, and the issue stops here? What does that solve? What problems does it create? Very little discussion on that as well. So that's one thing. Context and historicization. They're out of the reporting of the refugee crisis. The second is the presence of vulnerable others. We saw images that reproduce the dead ends, the impasses of previous visual styles. Massification, passivization, infantilization, and at the end, with a kind of playful graphics that we saw with Aylan, fictionalization of the refugees. And that's a point we didn't raise earlier. But a picture, an image, a photojournalistic image, is an image that actually connects you with reality. You might raise questions of authenticity and manipulation of the photographer, but it has a deictic function. It shows you the world out there. If you remove that indexicality from the image and you turn it into a painting, then you also fictionalize it, fictionalizing it further. You remove it from the world of reality. So we saw all these strategies being employed there. So refugees are indeed shown as superfluous people in our media, as stateless and voiceless. These images miss the opportunity to tell more diverse stories. Something that we might be able to find, indeed, elsewhere, not in journalism. And here is an art project that I bumped into when I was visiting New York last March in MoMA, which was simply a map and the hand of a refugee speaking and drawing on the Mediterranean map there, their own individual trips. And they were harrowing, all of them. There were about 6 of them. So you could go around and just follow them. There were about 5 minutes each, and they said, this is where I started, that's why I left, this is where I ended up, that's what happened. And so this particular refugee was saying about, was talking about the sea crossing to Europe and how traumatic it was because of the boat sinking and people dying all around them. So and then all the different kind of vectors signify the different directions that the trip took. So what do visuals like this do? They are basically enable refugees to narrate their own story. So far in our media, they're being narrated, but they do not narrate. And actually, there is this very important, for me, important concept that the Italian philosopher Adriana Cavarero has put forward, which is called narratability. And she says this is the quality of the unique being who has a voice and can speak his or her own history. This is what they lack, narratability. And this is what, in a way, removes you from the category of superfluous people and puts you in the category of historical beings. I have a story behind me. I didn't live for nothing. I'm coming from somewhere. I had a home, and I'm leaving that because of particular reasons. And that is what I can contribute here. That is what I want to do. These are the things that matter to me. We don't hear these things. We need to move away from current affairs and news in order to do that. But how many people have the opportunity to bump into this? Or visit an NGO website and see what is happening. So these are really the things that matter. And I want to leave you with voice and what it means for refugees to have a voice. Precisely because they are voiceless in our public spheres, they try to speak by writing messages. So this is one of those in Idomeni. And this is another one. Alternatives, link to war reporting, capitalize on digital media like the MoMA project, and tell stories, allow them to tell their own stories, explore multiple visual media and styles, present them as public agents, and link the online with the offline. No matter what we do in media, it is very important to also do things in the sites where these people are, and in our streets, so that we are heard. So that's all. I'm going to leave it at that. I thank you very much for your patience and for listening and for contributing as well. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lilie. I feel like I've been misreading images and newspapers for so long, and I feel a lot better equipped to read them now, going through that typology. We're going to take some questions before we go ahead to the drink. So, if any of you have some burning questions, now is the time. Yes, please.
Thank you very much.
Oh, do I share the discussion? Or
No, I'll share it.
Okay.
We've got a question here.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. I would like to know why you haven't been focusing also on other representations, other portrayals of the migrants and refugees, particularly the Syrian war, because I have the impression that it is not just this one type of empathy. Maybe aren't we, in this analysis, overreading on the politics of empathy and compassion and the type of responsibility that you linked to it. So I think of all these portrayals and presentations of refugees and migrants as threats, and the feeling you mentioned, pity, being replaced by rather fear and even anger, and hence the type of act, the doing that follows it, fencing and hunting refugees. We have also seen so much of conversation how Aylan Kurdi would grow anyway into becoming a terrorist or a rapist and so on. So, I mean, I feel like only representing this type of media portrayals is also another way of decontextualizing the discussion, the debate, reaching the truth, how this whole issue is being lived, experienced, and so on. And I also think about other celebrities like Mr. Orban, definitely, or Mr. Farage, who posed with the refugees behind him. So their political agency and Madame Merkel's political agency.
Okay, it's okay if we hand it over to Lilie. Thank you for that.
Yes. No, I think that is a very valid point. And actually we had a big discussion in the group about how we are going to kind of frame that particular media. I mean, there are certain outlets that have been doing the kind of hate politics. They have been playing the hate politics game, and there are very particular media outlets in the UK that have been doing so. But what I was interested in here was to really develop the question of responsibility, which starts from a fundamental admission acceptance and recognition that this is a space where we are required to act. And for us, the negative ones, the ones that portray refugees as cockroaches, fall outside that because they completely erase the possibility of taking any form of responsibility towards these people. I think perhaps if I had framed the presentation in terms of an overall typology of media representations of refugees without setting the question of responsibility at the heart of it, that would have been the first thing to notice. It is not about decontextualizing or sidelining the hate problem, but it is more about selection in terms of the framing question for the discussion here. So, but I completely agree with you. That is one of the categories that we actually have there. That is very important. And it comes even more forcefully forward when we talk about language, because there is also an analysis of the front pages in terms of the language that's being used, and the language that particular UK outlets have been using is an outlier. It's completely out of the kind of norms of civility and publicity and public communication that we would expect in reference to any other social group apart from that. So, no, I take your point. It's just a matter of framing. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question there on the left.
I think it's very hard to argue the massive role that media has in our times. And in the last decade, we had massive media coverage as the refugee crisis and also the Arab Spring, for example. What's the missing piece in the refugee crisis coverage that the Arab Spring coverage had, for example? Because in that coverage, you also had all the vulnerabilities you listed. You had icons, you have like the well-being, but it get to something more tangible probably than in the refugee crisis? Or is there a problem in the approach of the media? Do they have a clear final message they want to transmit? I think that was clearer with the Arab Spring and not so clear here. Are there similarities or not? And what's the difference? Why did it work once and it's not working so well like this?
I'm not sure what you mean by working. They worked in that case. How did they work?
They had two dictators, the Tunis and the Egypt dictators that were...
Oh, you mean, okay, yes. Oh, you mean in those countries, yeah? Because here we're talking about kind of a framework of institutional Western media talking about something that is perceived very ambivalently because its impact on our societies is not clear. That is a very different thing. That was, I mean, there are so many studies on social media and their use in the Arab Spring events, which demonstrate that even though the social media played a very important role in catalyzing activist mobilizations and contributed to change in those regimes, in fact, it was other offline factors that were the more decisive ones. So the social media did play a role there, within particular political and social and geopolitical contexts. The refugee issue is a very different thing. We're not talking primarily about social media, even though I think that would be a very good study to do. We're talking about institutional media and how, if you like, they gatekeep particular key questions of what they understand as security and geopolitical stability in particular ways by using visual representation to do so. So, you know, they kind of partly overlap, but I think fundamentally they're distinct questions.
I think we'll just take one more question, then we're going to go to drinks, and I know how late it is. I'm all a bit thirsty. So, lady here, the bosses. Yes, I chose you.
Just a question. Obviously, you were talking about what I would call case studies of the, people who've come through that telling their story. Surely there now must be lots examples of people who have come through the journey, who have set up in a form of home, who maybe have got some work already, or are doing good things that the community who sees them as unexpected and uninvited can now see that there are no threats and we should be doing more because we should be encouraging it. So where are these? Okay, so you have the MoMA Museum. Where are these case studies being written? Where are they being seen? Because as far as I can see, they aren't being seen, and that to me would be a really good way of showing people actually keep going, because these people are starting to come through and leading. Whilst ever they want to go home again, maybe they're doing okay.
I agree, these are very important representations to show. I mean, I have been wondering in the course of conceptualizing this project whether we should be focusing on on news rather than other media genres. Because if we talk about the mediated publicness and the appearances we get in touch with through the media, then I think there are so many other genres of the media where that encounter can take place. Fiction to begin with, documentary, right? And then again, social media. I think looking just at how these conversations have been taking place in Facebook or Twitter would have been a very, very kind of rich way to reach some other representations that are rival or competing to those ones. So the choice of doing only news, I think, led us to focusing on what we did and kind of coming up with the findings that we have, and which is, I think, a very telling story, but not the whole story. So I think that, and also, apart from other media genres like fiction, documentary, etc., it's also art where I think things are happening, and it is also NGO online communication that is very important. I mean, the most touching and significant testimonies that I have seen of people's narratability comes from there. Comes from them who work with them, know them, and are able to then record them and have them speak about their experiences in that way.
Do you think the mainstream media got hold of these heroes of family, these examples of successes, of
I think there are examples.
Do you think they would represent them in the right way? Because surely that would be a really good thing.
I think, as we showed here, and I think, you know, I mean, with the kind of inclusion but omission for the purpose of this presentation, the kind of hate speech, I think these are really the dominant ones that we have seen. So when we talk about empathy and pity, this is as far as we go. We don't go further than that. As I said, you need a different tempo and a different structure of narration in order to be able to offer that voice. And I think that is mostly possible in other genres. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure I answered that very well, but that's it.
I think that was perfect. Ambiguous no with